The bullet tore through the porch post, 2 handspans from the girl's temple. She didn't scream. She dropped and rolled like someone had taught her exactly this, back when she was still too young to ask why. 5 riders. No warning. They came out of a sunset the color of an old penny, and they came quiet, which was the wrong kind of wrong, because robbers always come loud. Men who ride silent don't want anyone to hear them until hearing doesn't matter anymore. Inside the house, the smell of cornbread was still warm in the air. Gunsmoke laid itself down on top of it. Those two things should never stand together in one room. A rough voice cut through the haze. "Find the box! Not the girl, not the old man, the box!" A cherrywood box on the mantel, no bigger than a loaf of bread. 25 years, and she had never once been allowed to open it. Her father set down the hinge he'd been mending. His face wasn't frightened. It was the face of a man who had been waiting 19 years to hear those hooves. He said one word. Inside. The wheat was the color of an old penny that evening. Dying light, late October. Larkspur Hollow, Wyoming Territory, 1,887, a town so small it didn't earn a dot on most maps, just a smudge where the foothills of the Laramie Range gave way to flat, honest dirt. Margaret Colton stood at the edge of the north field with a scythe in her hand and dust on her boots. 25 years old. Small frame. Quiet eyes that missed nothing. She wasn't supposed to be beautiful out here. Not in a place like this. Not with hands calloused from rope and hoe handle. But she was the kind of beauty that didn't ask permission. Sun-browned skin. A jaw that could go soft or set like iron depending on the hour. Men in town noticed. She pretended not to notice them noticing. Because that was easier. Because noticing led to talking. And talking led to questions. And questions were the one thing Margaret Colton had learned, since she was old enough to hold a rifle steady, to avoid. The farmhouse sat behind her. Weathered clapboard. A porch that sagged on the left side, no matter how many times her father shimmed the post. Smoke curled thin and gray from the chimney. Supper smell drifting out. Corn bread, beans. The smell of an ordinary Tuesday. She didn't know yet that ordinary was about to end. Franklin Colton was 61 years old and moved like a man 20 years younger when the work demanded it and 40 years older when it didn't. He was mending a hinge on the barn door. Simple task. His hands, thick-knuckled, scarred across 2 fingers, in a way he never explained, worked the screw slow and deliberate. He always worked slow and deliberate. Except when he didn't, which was rare. Which was so rare that Margaret had only seen it twice in her whole life. Once when a rattler got into the henhouse. Once when a drunk cowhand raised a hand to her at the spring social 3 years back, and her father crossed 20 feet of dance floor before she'd even finished flinching. Both times it had frightened her more than whatever the danger was. She never asked him why. She told herself that was respect. Told herself a daughter didn't pry into a father's past. Not when he'd raised her alone since she was small. Not when he'd never once raised his voice to her. Not when every lesson he'd taught her how to read wind on grass, how to find water in dry country, how to put a fist into soft tissue instead of bone, had come wrapped in the same 3 words. For your safety. That was the whole explanation. For your safety. Every single time. She'd stopped questioning it around age 16. Not because the answer satisfied her. Because the not asking had become its own kind of comfort. A door she didn't open because she liked the room the way it was. She didn't know that door was about to get kicked in. Literally. The keepsake box sat on the mantel inside, where it always sat. Small. Cherrywood. Dark with age and handling. No bigger than a loaf of bread. A tiny brass latch that didn't quite close right anymore. Margaret had asked about it once. Years ago. Just once. "What's in it, Pa?" "Nothing that concerns you." "Then why do you keep it?" He'd looked at her a long moment. Long enough that she remembered it still. Remembered the particular stillness of his face, the way his jaw worked once before he answered. Because some things you keep even when they hurt to keep. She hadn't understood it then. Wouldn't understand it for a few more hours, when the box lay in splinters on the floorboards, and the truth came pouring out of it like blood from a wound too long ignored. But that was later. Right now the sun was going down orange, and the hinge was almost fixed, and Wyatt Cross was leading the mule back from the creek, whistling something tuneless and off-key, sleeves rolled to the elbow, canvas trousers, dark at the knee from kneeling in the mud to check the animal's shoe. Wyatt was 25. Same age as Margaret, near enough. Hired on 2 years back when his own family's spread went under in a bad winter. Easy laugh. Ease your hands, good with animals, good with tools, good with the kind of quiet work that didn't ask questions either. Margaret liked him, trusted him, the way you trust a man who's shown you nothing but steadiness for 2 straight years. She had no reason not to. Not yet. Storms rolling in? Wyatt called out, nodding toward the west, where clouds stacked purple and heavy against the last of the light. Feel it in my knee before I feel it in the sky most days. You're 25, Wyatt. Not 60. Tell that to my knee. She almost smiled. Would have if the wind hadn't shifted right then. Just a breath of wrongness in it. Dust that didn't belong to their dust. A smell underneath the wood smoke and the beans that her body recognized half a second before her mind did. Horses. Not their horses. 4 sets of hooves, maybe 5, coming fast and coming quiet, which was worse, because men riding hard usually came loud, came shouting, came the way trouble always announced itself in a place like Larkspur Hollow. These men weren't announcing anything, which meant they didn't want to be heard until it was too late to matter. Margaret's stomach dropped first. Her mind caught up second, because there was no reason, because nobody rode this quiet toward a farmhouse unless quiet was the point. Because, Pa, she said, not loud, just enough. Franklin Colton's head came up from the hinge like a man surfacing from deep water, and in that half-second something moved behind his eyes that Margaret had never seen before. Not fear exactly. Recognition. The look of a man who has been waiting 19 years for a knock on the door and finally hears it. Inside. Pa, what? Now Margaret. He never used her full name. Never. It landed like a slap. She ran. The riders broke the tree line at the edge of the property, just as she hit the porch steps. 5 of them, dark shapes against the bruised sky, and the first shot cracked out before anyone had said a single word, splintering the porch post 2 feet from her head, and every quiet lesson her father had ever drilled into her drop. Move. Don't freeze. Never freeze fired through her body all at once, like something switched on. She dropped. Rolled. Came up behind the water trough, with her heart slamming so hard she could feel it in her teeth. Except this wasn't supposed to happen. Except she'd spent her whole life believing the lessons were just her father being careful. Except careful men didn't teach their daughters to disarm a grown man twice her size, with nothing but a wrist lock and a shift of weight, not unless they expected, someday, for that daughter to need it, which meant her father had always expected this, which meant he had always known this day might come, which meant every for your safety of her whole childhood had been a promise he'd been keeping against a debt she never knew existed. There wasn't time to think about that. There was only time to move. The barn door where her father had been standing hung open and empty. She couldn't see him. Panic tried to climb up her throat, and she shoved it back down, hard, the way he'd taught her. Panic is a luxury, he used to say. Panic later. Survive now. She came around the trough low and fast toward the house ends. A man on horseback wheeled toward her. Big. Duster coat flaring out behind him. Hat low. A revolver already leveled and steady in a gloved hand. Girl. Stay down and you don't get hurt. She didn't stay down. She didn't have time to decide to not stay down. Her body decided for her, the way it had been trained to decide. Years and years of quiet afternoons behind the barn where her father called it chores, and it was never chores. Not really. And she came up under the horse's reach, with the scythe still gripped in her fist, and swept the blunt side of it hard across the animal's front legs. The horse screamed and reared. The rider went sideways, hit the dirt with a sound like a dropped sack of grain, and Margaret was already moving past him toward the porch before he'd stopped rolling. Because stopping meant dying. Because her father's voice was in her skull now, calm even in memory, even in crisis. Keep moving. A moving target lives longer than a brave one. Glass shattered somewhere behind her. A man's voice rough, cutting through the chaos. Find the box! Vance wants the box. Not the girl, not the old man. The box. Vance. The name snagged in her mind, even as her body kept fighting. Kept moving. Filed itself away in some cold corner for later. Because there was no later right now, there was only now. There was only the second man coming at her from the porch steps, with a knife low in his hand and murder plain on his face. She didn't run. She'd been taught not to run from a knife. Running from a blade just gave a man a straight line and your back to put it in. So she stepped in instead. Inside his reach. Too close for him to swing full. drove the heel of her palm up under his chin the way her father had shown her 100, 200, 500 times behind that same barn, always saying it was for wolves, for drifters, for the kind of danger a farm girl might someday meet on a lonely road. And it had never once, not once, been about wolves. The man's head snapped back. He staggered. She didn't wait to see him fall. She was already through the door, into the house, into the smell of cornbread and gun smoke that didn't belong together, and there was her father, on the floor. Blood on his shirt, blood on the plank boards beneath him, spreading, slow and dark and wrong in the lamplight, and a third man standing over him with the keepsake box raised high above his head like a hammer. High! The box came down. It shattered against the hearthstone. Cherry wood splitting along its grain, in a sound that was somehow louder than every gunshot that had come before it, louder than the screaming horse, louder than her own heart, and something inside it scattered across the floorboards. A glint of tarnished metal, a curl of yellowed paper. The man who'd smashed it didn't even look down, didn't know what he'd just broken open, didn't care. His eyes were already back on her father, on the gun in his own hand, on the job he'd been paid to finish. Margaret didn't think. There wasn't room left in her for thinking. There was only 19 years of quiet Sunday afternoons pouring out of her at once, every lesson stacked on every lesson, and she crossed that room faster than she'd ever crossed anything in her life. He turned. Too late. She hit his gun hand first knuckles into wrist, exactly where her father had shown her, exactly where a joint gives before a bone breaks, and the revolver clattered away across the floor even as the man swung his other fist at her head. She ducked under it, came up inside his guard, and for the first time in her whole life, Margaret Colton did something her father had taught her but never, not once, told her the true purpose of. She hurt someone. On purpose. To save a life. It was over in seconds. He went down and stayed down, and the room went strange and silent except for her own ragged breathing, and her father's ragged breathing beneath it, weaker, wetter, wrong, outside, hooves, retreating, fast now, loud now, because there was no more reason for quiet. She didn't chase them. She dropped to her knees beside her father instead, hands shaking now that there was nothing left to fight, pressing them hard against the wound in his side. The way, of course he'd taught her to do that too, years ago, calling it just in case, calling it nothing, calling it everything except the truth. Pa, stay with me. Pa, his eyes opened, found her face, and for one terrible moment he looked at her like he didn't recognize the woman kneeling over him, like he was looking through her, back through years, back through a version of his own life he'd buried so deep he'd almost believed the grave held. Ruth, he whispered. Margaret went cold. Pa, it's me. It's Margaret. His eyes fluttered, focused, slow, painful, back onto her face. Maggie, he breathed. Just her name this time. Just that. And then his eyes rolled back, and he went still, breathing shallow and fast. And Margaret Colton knelt in a wrecked house, with her father's blood soaking through her dress, and a stranger's name, Ruth, ringing in her skull like a bell that wouldn't stop. She didn't have time to wonder about it. Not yet. She had a wound to pack, a horse to saddle, a doctor to fetch, 6 miles down a dark road, alone, with her hands still shaking and her heart still slamming, and some cold, clear part of her mind, the part her father had built, brick by careful brick, over 25 years of for your safety, already cataloging everything. 5 riders. 1 name spoken. Vance. Not hers. Not her father's. The box. Shattered on the hearth. And a word, Ruth, that her father had never once said in her hearing, in her whole life, until the moment he thought he might be dying. The ride to Doc Holloway's place took 31 minutes. She counted every one of them, because counting was better than thinking. Because, if she let herself think about her father's face, going pale in the lamplight, she was going to come apart at the seams, somewhere on a dark road, with nobody around to put her back together. So she counted, and she rode. And underneath the counting, underneath the hoofbeats, her mind kept snagging on the same 3 things over and over like a needle stuck in a groove. Vance, the box. Ruth, Doc Holloway, was a broad, unhurried man in his 50s who kept his medical bag by the door year-round because Larkspur Hollow didn't believe in convenient emergencies. He took one look at Margaret's face, pale under the dust, blood dried dark on her hands and dress, and didn't ask a single question. just grabbed the bag and followed her out to the horses. That was the kind of town it was when it wanted to be, the kind where a man saw need and moved before he saw explanation. It would take longer later for her to understand that not everyone in Larkspur Hollow was built that way. They rode back together in silence because there wasn't breath to spare for talking, and Margaret's mind kept doing the thing minds do in crisis. Replaying, replaying, replaying. The horse rearing. The knife man's chin under her palm. Her father on the floor. The box. The box. Because that detail kept surfacing above all the others, the way a stone keeps surfacing in a plowed field, no matter how many times you clear it. The man hadn't wanted money, hadn't wanted the horses, the cattle, the little tin of coin her father kept under the floorboard for hard winters. He'd wanted the box, named it even, before he'd known what breaking it would spill out onto the floor. Find the box. Vance said the box. Not money, not guns. The box, which meant a man she'd never once heard her father mention had known exactly what that box contained. Which meant Margaret Colton, 25 years old, born and raised on this same patch of Wyoming dirt, did not. That was the thought that scared her more than the gunfire had, more than the knife, more than her father's blood on her hands. Because a stranger with a hired gun knew something about her own family that she had spent her entire life not knowing. By the time they reached the farmhouse, 3 neighbors had already gathered the Hendersons from the next spread over, drawn by gunfire, carrying flat and clear across open country the way it does at dusk. Mrs. Henderson had lit every lamp in the house and was pressing clean linen against Franklin's wound with the brisk efficiency of a woman who'd buried 2 husbands and wasn't in a hurry to bury a neighbor too. Doc Holloway knelt beside him, hands moving fast now, sleeves rolled, face set in the particular blankness of a man doing math he doesn't like the answer to. Bullet went through, he said, not looking up. Missed the gut. That's the good news. And the bad? Margaret's voice came out steadier than she felt. He's 61 years old and he's lost a lot of blood. Bad news is bad news, whichever way you slice it, Miss Colton. I won't lie to you and tell you pretty stories. She appreciated that, even as it landed like a stone in her chest. Appreciated a man who told the truth plain instead of dressed up soft. It would be a long time before she trusted anyone else in this town the same way. Word travels fast in a small place. By the time Marshal Otis Pratt's horse ambled up the farm lane, near on 2 hours after the shooting, half of Larkspur Hollow already knew a farmer had been shot, and his daughter had fought off 5 armed men with her bare hands and a garden scythe. The story had already started to change in the telling. That was how small towns worked. Truth went in one end, and something stranger came out the other. Pratt was a heavy-set man somewhere past 50, with a mustache gone more gray than brown, and a manner that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else, doing anything else, than standing on a blood-stained porch, asking questions he didn't much want answered. Evenin', Miss Colton. He didn't take his hat off. Heard there was trouble out here. 5 men rode onto our property and shot my father, Marshal. So I heard. He looked past her into the house, at the shattered box still scattered across the floorboards, at the dark stain soaking into the wood. Something crossed his face, gone before she could name it. Any of 'em say who sent 'em? Margaret's jaw tightened, because here it was, the moment to say the name out loud. Vance. And something in her, some instinct her father had spent a lifetime sharpening without ever explaining why, told her not to. Not to him? Not yet. No, she said. Just came in shooting. Pratt nodded slow, like a man confirming something he already expected rather than learning something new. Robbers, then. Been a rash of it lately, out past the Bell Creek crossing. Fella's farm got hit last spring, same sort of thing. Did you catch whoever did that one? A pause. Just half a second too long. Investigation's ongoing, he said. Margaret had grown up in Larkspur Hollow her whole life. Had watched Otis Pratt pin on that star 11 years back, watched him ride out after cattle thieves and drunk brawlers and every ordinary trouble a frontier town produced. She had never once in 11 years heard him say a sentence that sounded so much like a wall going up. Marshal, she kept her voice even. Flat. 5 armed men rode onto my family's land and shot my father nearly dead. What exactly are you going to do about it? I'll ride the roads tomorrow. Ask around town. See if anybody saw strangers pass through. He finally met her eyes. and there was something almost like apology in it, buried under something else she couldn't name yet. Something that looked, if she was being honest with herself later, a great deal like fear. That's about all I can promise you tonight, Miss Colton. Man your father's age, laid up like that, best thing you can do is stay close to him. Let the law handle the rest. He tipped his hat, finally, and turned his horse back down the lane. And Margaret stood on the porch and watched him go, and felt something crystallize in her chest. Cold and hard and absolutely certain. The law was not going to handle this. Whatever this was, she was going to have to. She didn't sleep that night. Couldn't have, even if her mind had let her. Because every time she closed her eyes, she was back in that front room. Gunsmoke and cornbread, her father folding to the floor, the box coming apart against the hearthstone in a sound like something breaking that had been waiting 19 years to break. Instead, she sat at his bedside with a lamp turned low, and somewhere past midnight, once Doc Holloway had gone home and Mrs. Henderson had gone home and Wyatt, bruised across one cheekbone from the fight, quiet and shaken but steady, always steady, had finished, dragging the last of the wrecked furniture back into place. Margaret finally let herself walk back into the front room and kneel down on the floorboards where the box had shattered. The pieces lay scattered in the lamplight. Cherry wood, splintered clean where the grain had given way. A brass latch, bent now, useless. And among the wreckage, two things that didn't belong to the box at all. Two things the box had been built to hide. The first was a badge. Tarnished silver, dulled almost black with age. The shape of a five-pointed star inside a circle, worn smooth at the edges the way metal wears smooth from being carried in a pocket. Touched, turned over in a man's hand. 1,000 quiet nights when he thought no one was watching. Margaret had seen a badge like this before, once. A traveling federal man had passed through Larkspur Hollow 2 summers back, and she'd caught a glimpse of the star pinned to his vest before he rode on toward Cheyenne. Deputy United States Marshal. The words were still legible, just barely, cut into the tarnished metal. Her hands weren't steady, picking it up, which surprised her, because her hands were always steady. Her father had made sure of that. Steady hands, steady mind, that was the whole of what he'd built in her. Except this, except now. The second thing was worse. A photograph old, the edges soft and worn from handling, the image faded sepia brown the way old photographs go, and it had been torn not accidentally, not by age, but deliberately, torn clean down the middle so that only half remained. The half that remained showed a man, younger than her father was now, much younger, clean-shaven, where her father had worn a beard for as long as she could remember, but the eyes were the same, unmistakably the same. Her father's eyes, 20 years younger, looking out of a photograph that had been ripped in half and hidden inside a locked box for nearly 2 decades. He was wearing a badge in the photograph, the same badge, pinned to a dark vest, over a white shirt, and one arm, the arm that would have connected to whoever stood beside him, whoever had been torn away and lost, rested around a shape that no longer existed on the page, just a jagged edge where a second person used to be. Margaret sat on the floor of her wrecked front room, holding half a photograph of a man who looked exactly like her father and was not, could not be, the same quiet farmer who had raised her. Because farmers did not wear federal badges. Because farmers did not get torn photographs hidden inside locked boxes on their mantels. Because farmers, when men came asking after something called the box, did not go the color of old ash and say a single word inside with the particular flatness of a man who had spent 19 years waiting to hear it. She turned the badge over in her hands. There, scratched into the back, in small, careful letters, almost worn away by thumb and time, was a name. Not Colton T-Bell. She stared at it a long time. Long enough that the lamp guttered low, and the house went cold around her, and somewhere upstairs her father breathed shallow and ragged in a bed that had been his for 19 years under a name that, she was beginning to understand with a slow and terrible certainty, was not the one he'd been born with. She didn't remember deciding to go upstairs. Just found herself there, sitting in the hard chair beside his bed, the badge and the torn photograph both clutched in one fist, like she could keep the truth contained, just by holding on tight enough. He was pale, sweat damp. His breathing had the wet catch to it that Doc Holloway had warned her about. Not gone, not yet, but not good either. "Pa," she said. "Quiet. Pa, can you hear me? His eyes opened, slow, fever bright. Maggie. Who's Ruth? The question came out before she'd meant to ask it, before she'd decided the timing was right, before anything except that his eyes were finally open, and she couldn't stand not knowing another minute longer. His face did something complicated, something that moved through pain and grief, and something that might have been relief, before settling into a stillness she recognized, because it was the same stillness he'd worn the day he told her some things you keep, even when they hurt to keep. Not tonight, he whispered. Please, not tonight, Maggie. They knew about the box, Pa. A man said a name. Vance said Vance wanted the box. Not the money, not us, the box. And inside it there's a badge with a name on it that isn't ours, and half a photograph of a man who looks exactly like you, except 20 years younger, and wearing a federal star. And I need, Pa. I need you to tell me who you are. Because that was the true question underneath all the others. Not who is Ruth. Not who is Vance. Who are you? Who is the man who raised me? Who have I been living beside my whole life without knowing? Her father closed his eyes. For a long moment, she thought he'd slip back into fever sleep, that the answer was going to have to wait for a tomorrow that might never come if Doc Holloway's math turned out the way math like that usually turned out. Then his hand found hers, weak, trembling, but it found hers the way it always had, since she was small enough to need it found. My name, he said, so quiet she had to lean close to catch it, was Thaddeus Bell. The name landed in her chest like a second gunshot. I was a deputy United States Marshal, Kansas cattle towns, mostly, 19 years ago. His breath rattled, caught, steadied. There was a man, my partner, someone I trusted the way you trust your own hand. He did something terrible, Maggie, and let the world believe it was mine. And when I wouldn't stay quiet about it, when I wouldn't let him bury what he'd done, he made sure I couldn't stay a Marshal, couldn't stay Thaddeus Bell, couldn't stay anything at all except a dead man walking under a false name in a territory far enough west that nobody would ever come looking. And Ruth, Margaret said. Her voice didn't sound like her own. Was Ruth my mother? His eyes opened again, wet, this time, in a way she had never once in her life seen her father's eyes go wet. Ruth Bell, he said. Your mother's name. She didn't die in childbirth, Maggie. That was the story I told you, because the truth was too dangerous for a little girl to carry. I don't know if she's alive. I have spent 19 years not knowing, and not letting myself hope, because hope was a thing I couldn't afford to carry either. Not while I was hiding you. Not while I was keeping you safe. Margaret sat very still, the badge cold in her palm, half a photograph of a stranger who was her father pressed against her heart, and felt her entire understanding of her own life come apart and reassemble itself into something she didn't recognize. Every lesson behind the barn, every for your safety, every quiet, patient hour spent teaching a farm girl to move like a soldier, to read a room like a lawman, to put a man down before he could put her down first. He hadn't been protecting her from wolves. He'd been protecting her from this, from tonight, from 5 riders and a shattered box and a name Vance that had been waiting 19 years, patient as a held breath, for the moment it could finally come, collect what it believed it was owed. Rest, she told him, because there was nothing else true enough to say, and because Doc Holloway's warning sat heavy in the room, even unspoken. We'll talk more when you're stronger. His hand tightened once around hers. Maggie, whoever comes asking, whoever comes hunting, you don't go at this alone. Promise me. She thought about Marshal Pratt's half-second pause. Thought about the wall that had gone up behind his eyes the moment she'd almost said the name Vance out loud. Thought about a town she'd trusted her whole life, suddenly looking, for the first time, like a place with locked doors and hidden rooms of its own. I promise, she said. It wasn't entirely a lie. She simply didn't yet know who she'd be able to trust enough to not be alone with. Dawn came gray and reluctant over Larkspur Hollow, the storm clouds from the evening, before finally breaking into a thin, cold rain that beaded on the shattered glass still scattered across the front room floor. Margaret hadn't slept. Had spent the last hours of darkness sitting at the kitchen table with the badge and the torn photograph laid out in front of her, like evidence in a trial. Nobody else knew was happening. Wyatt found her there when he came in from the barn, hat dripping, face still bruised from the fight. How's your pa? Sleeping. Doc says the next 2 days'll tell. She didn't look up from the photograph. Wyatt. Did you get a look at any of them? The men? He was quiet a moment, long enough that she finally raised her eyes to his. One of 'em, he said slowly. Big fella, scar through his eyebrow. Never seen him before in my life. But he hesitated, and something crossed his face that she filed away without quite naming it yet. Something she'd have cause to remember much later, much too late. But there was something familiar about the way they rode in. Quiet like that. Like men who'd been told exactly where to go and exactly what not to touch till they found what they came for. Told by who? Couldn't say, Miss Colton. He met her eyes steady, and she believed him because there was no reason yet not to. I'll ride to town later. Ask around. See if anybody in Larkspur Hollows had strangers passing through lately. Thank you, Wyatt. He nodded, turned toward the door, then paused. Whatever this is, he said, you know I'm not going anywhere. Your pa took me in when nobody else would. That's not a debt I forget. She managed a small, exhausted smile. I know. She would think about those words a great many times in the days to come, turn them over the way she was turning the badge over now. Cold metal, worn smooth, hiding more than it showed. For now, though, she had a father upstairs fighting for his life under a name that wasn't his own. She had a town whose lawmen flinched at a stranger's name. She had a mother she'd believed dead for 25 years who might, somewhere out there, still be breathing under Wyoming's sky, or somewhere far beyond it. And she had a single word Vance sitting in her chest like a coal that hadn't gone out. Margaret Colton set the badge down on the table, pinned it there with 2 fingers, and looked at it a long moment in the thin gray light of morning. She'd spent her whole life being told the lessons were for her safety, never once been told they were preparation. Well, the thought came cold and clear and entirely her own, formed at last out of 25 years of quiet Sunday afternoons behind a barn that had never, not once, been about wolves. She was prepared now. Whoever Vance was, whatever he wanted. Whatever truth was still buried out there waiting. The way the badge had waited, the way the photograph had waited, the way her father's real name had waited 19 patient years inside a locked cherrywood box. She was going to find it. All of it. Because a girl raised gentle doesn't come up swinging the way she had last night. Because a farmer doesn't flinch at his own real name, like a man remembering a grave he thought he'd never have to visit again. Because nothing about her life, she was beginning to understand, had ever been quite as simple as it looked from the porch at sunset. And because this thought arrived last, quietest, and somehow heaviest of all whoever had sent 5 armed men to tear her family apart, for the sake of an old wooden box, had made one very serious mistake. They hadn't known who they were sending them to. They didn't know that the small, quiet farm girl in the little house past the wheat field had been trained, every single day of her life, without ever being told why, for exactly this moment. Outside, the rain kept falling on Larkspur Hollow, washing the blood from the porch steps down into the dark Wyoming earth. And somewhere out past the tree line, in a direction Margaret Colton didn't yet know to look, a man named Garrison Vance sat in a warm study with a glass of good whiskey, waiting for word that a job had been finished. He did not yet know it hadn't been. He would find out soon enough. 3 days. That's how long it took for Thaddeus Bell to open his eyes and stay awake long enough to hold a cup of broth, without his hand shaking it half onto the quilt. 3 days of fever breaking and rebuilding itself like weather that couldn't decide what it wanted to be. 3 days of Margaret Colton sitting in that hard chair by his bed, badge in one hand, torn photograph in the other, waiting for a man to get strong enough to finish a story he'd started bleeding out on his own front room floor. She didn't wait well, because waiting had never been her strength. Her father had taught her patience with a rifle, patience with a rope, patience with tracking a deer through timber for 6 hours without a sound. But patience with not knowing patience with sitting in a chair while the truth of her whole life lay half told, and bleeding upstairs. That was a different animal altogether, and it was eating her alive 1 slow hour at a time. On the morning of the 4th day, Doc Holloway pronounced her father out of danger, and strictly, sternly, absolutely forbidden from getting out of that bed for another 2 weeks minimum, which meant somebody else was going to have to go finish what the box had started. Margaret stood in the kitchen with her father's old Colt strapped low on her hip, his, not the one she usually carried, because something in her wanted the weight of his history against her leg today, and looked at her own reflection in the window glass. Dust-colored travel dress, hair pulled back tight, eyes that had stopped looking like a farm girl's eyes sometime around. The moment a man's box came apart on the hearthstone, she didn't recognize herself entirely. Didn't mind that she didn't. You're not going alone. Wyatt stood in the doorway, hat already on, that same steady look he always wore. Told you that already. I know what you told me. So? So get the horses. He almost smiled. Almost. There was something underneath it lately that she couldn't quite name, a tightness around his eyes that hadn't been there 2 years ago. A way he sometimes went quiet mid-sentence, like a man rehearsing a lie before he told it, she noticed. Filed it away the way she filed everything away now. She just didn't know yet which drawer it belonged in. Larkspur Hollow in daylight looked like nothing had happened. That was the strange cruelty of small towns. A woman's whole life could come apart in one violent evening, and by morning, the general store still had its awning rolled out, and the blacksmith still had his fire going, and old men still sat outside the mercantile, arguing about cattle prices, like the world hadn't tilted sideways for somebody just up the road. Marshal Otis Pratt's office sat between the bank and the feed store, a squat brick building with a single barred window and a hitching post out front that had seen better decades. Margaret tied her horse and went in without knocking. Pratt looked up from his desk. Didn't rise. Miss Colton. He set down his coffee cup, slow, deliberate. A man buying himself time to decide how a conversation was going to go before it started going. How's your father? Alive? No thanks to you riding those roads like you promised. I rode 'em. He gestured vaguely at nothing. Found nothing. Whoever hit your place, they're long gone by now. Territory's big, Miss Colton. Men who don't want finding generally don't get found. A man in my house said a name before he tried to kill my father. She kept her voice level, flat, the way she'd learned, over 3 sleepless nights, to keep it. Garrison Vance. Does that mean anything to you? Something happened in Pratt's face. Not much. A small thing. The kind of small thing you'd miss if you weren't looking for it, if 3 days hadn't taught you to look for exactly this kind of small thing, in exactly this kind of moment. His eyes went somewhere else for half a breath, then came back. Can't say it does. He was lying. She knew it, the way she knew weather coming, the way she knew a horse about to spook, before the horse itself knew it. Some old instinct her father had sharpened in her, without either of them ever calling it what it was. Marshal. She leaned both hands flat on his desk. 5 armed men rode onto my father's land in evening light, shot him nearly dead, and tore apart our home looking for something specific, something they were told to find by name. And you're telling me that doesn't ring a single bell in this whole town. I'm telling you what I know. His jaw was tight now, tighter than a man discussing nothing ought to be, which is nothing. And I'll thank you to remember who wears the star in this town, Miss Colton, before you come in here talking to me like I'm the one who did wrong here. Nobody said you did wrong, Marshal. Didn't have to. He stood now, finally, and there it was, fear, plain as daylight, moving underneath the anger like a current under ice. You come in here with that look on your face, asking names, acting like the law in this town's got something to hide. I got a wife, Miss Colton. I got a mortgage on this office and a boy studying law back east that I'm paying for. I got things I can't afford to go poking at. He stopped himself. Too late. Because that was a confession, wasn't it? Not in words exactly, but close enough. Close enough that Margaret Colton stood very still in that office and understood with a cold, clean certainty that the man wearing the star in Larkspur Hollow was afraid of something bigger than 5 armed strangers. He was afraid of somebody who could reach a mortgage payment, a boy's tuition, back east, somebody with money enough and patience enough to know exactly where a man's weak spots lived. Thank you for your time, Marshal, she said, and walked out before he could say another word he'd regret. Outside, Wyatt was waiting with the horses. Well, he knows something. She swung up into the saddle, jaw tight, and he's too scared to say it. Scared of what? That, Margaret said, turning her horse toward the edge of town, is exactly what we're going to find out. Amos Tillman lived 4 miles south of Larkspur Hollow in a cabin that looked like it had grown up out of the ground rather than been built on top of it, log walls gone silver with age, a porch cluttered with traps and tools, and the particular organized chaos of a man who'd lived alone a long time and made his peace with it. Margaret had heard his name her whole life. A friend of her father's, folks said, though nobody ever said much more than that. An old Texas Ranger who'd drifted north sometime before she was born and settled into the kind of quiet, watchful life that men who'd seen too much violence sometimes chose for themselves. She'd never once, in 25 years, wondered why her father kept a friend like that, so close. She wondered now. Amos answered his door with a shotgun half raised out of pure habit, took one look at her face, and lowered it slow. Margaret, his voice was gravel-worn smooth. 60, maybe 65. Silver-bearded, eyes pale blue and sharp as broken glass under heavy brows. Heard about your pa. He alive? Alive. Getting stronger. Good. A long pause. His eyes moved past her to Wyatt, waiting by the horses, then back to her face. You didn't ride 4 miles to tell me that. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her coat and drew out the badge, held it flat on her open palm, and watched the old man's face change. It went through several things at once. Recognition first instant, unmistakable. The way a man's face changes when he sees a ghost he'd stopped expecting to see. Then something like grief. Then something that might have been anger, old and banked but not extinguished. Just waiting, the way a coal waits under ash. Where'd you get that? He said. It wasn't really a question. It was hidden in a box my father kept on the mantel. Men came to our farm looking for that box specifically. Shot my father trying to take it. She held his gaze steady. I need you to tell me who Thaddeus Bell was, Mr. Tillman. Because my father won't. Not all of it. Not yet. The old man was quiet a long, long moment. Then he stepped back from the doorway. You'd best come in. The cassin smelled of wood smoke and gun oil and coffee gone slightly bitter from sitting too long on the stove. Amos poured 3 cups without asking if anyone wanted one, set them down on a table scarred with knife marks and old burns, and sat heavy in a chair across from Margaret, like a man settling in for a story he'd been carrying a long time, and was almost relieved, finally, to sit down. 19 years ago, he began, I rode with the Rangers down in Texas. Your pa was a deputy United States Marshal. Out of Kansas, mostly. Different jurisdictions. Different lives. But lawmen cross paths, Margaret. Same rail lines, same cattle towns, same handful of decent men, trying to hold back a whole country's worth of bad ones. He turned his coffee cup slow between his hands. Didn't drink. Your pa had a partner back then. Man named Cole. Cole Vance. Margaret's stomach dropped, because that name Vance she'd heard already. Spat out in a gunman's shout, the night the box shattered. Heard it, and it had waited in her chest ever since like a coal that hadn't gone out. Now here it was again, from an old ranger's careful mouth, wearing a whole life behind it. Vance, she repeated. Slow. Careful. Like handling something that might go off. Cole and Thaddeus were close as brothers, way I heard it told. Trusted each other with their lives more times than either one could count. Which is exactly why what happened next cut so deep. Amos's jaw worked once, hard. There was a robbery. Federal payroll. Moving through cattle country under Marshal escort. A quarter of it went missing. And the evidence, every last piece of it, pointed straight at Thaddeus Bell. But it was Cole. It wasn't a question. She already knew. Had known, somewhere underneath conscious thought, since the moment the box shattered on the hearthstone and spat a torn photograph out into the lamplight. It was Cole, Amos confirmed. Quack. Your pa figured it out inside a week. Confronted him private. Gave him the chance to make it right. Turn himself in. Face what he'd done like a man. Cole didn't take it, a long breath. Instead, he made sure the evidence pointed harder. Made sure witnesses remembered things that never happened. And when Thaddeus wouldn't stay quiet, wouldn't let an innocent name get buried under a guilty man's crime, Cole hired men to make sure he never got the chance to clear it. They tried to kill him. Came close enough that your pa had to let the world believe they'd finished the job. Faked his own death, Margaret. Took his infant daughter and his young wife and ran west with nothing but the clothes on his back and a badge he couldn't ever wear again. Amos's pale eyes found hers. Steady, unflinching, changed his name. Buried Thaddeus Bell in an unmarked grave that never held a body, and built himself a whole new life out of wheat and quiet. All so his little girl could grow up safe from a man who'd already proven he'd kill to protect his lie. Margaret sat very still, because it was one thing to suspect your whole childhood had been built around a hidden truth. It was another thing entirely to hear it laid out plain, in an old ranger's gravel voice, over coffee gone cold in a cabin smelling of wood smoke. What happened to Cole? she asked after. Where did he go? Amos's face went hard as flint. Made himself rich. That's what happened to him. Took the stolen payroll. Disappeared west, same as your pa did. Only he didn't have to hide his face doing it. He got to keep his own name. More or less. Changed it just enough. Garrison Vance. He watched her face carefully as the name landed, watched understanding, arrived there like weather crossing open plains. Built himself the biggest cattle spread in 3 counties. Owns half of Larkspur Hollow, one way or another, though most folks in town are too grateful for his money to ask too many questions about where it came from. The room went very quiet. Because there it was, the whole shape of it, finally, laid bare on a scarred wooden table. Not a random robbery. Not 5 nameless outlaws chasing easy money. A debt, 19 years old, finally coming due. He's still afraid of my father, Margaret said slowly, thinking it through even as she spoke it. That's what this is. Not revenge for something that happened. Fear that something's finally going to come out. The box, Amos said. Whatever's inside it. That badge, that photograph. Whatever else your pa kept hid all these years. Vance has spent 2 decades hoping. It got buried, along with the man he thought he'd killed. And now he knows Thaddeus Bell is still alive, Margaret finished. Her voice had gone very flat, very cold. And he's terrified of what my father's kept as proof. Amos nodded slow. Which means, he said, this isn't over, Margaret. Not by a long stretch. A man like Garrison Vance doesn't send 5 riders and call it finished when the job goes wrong. He sends more. And next time, he won't make the mistake of underestimating what your pa raised you to be. They rode back toward town in silence. For a long while, Wyatt trailing a length behind. On the narrow trail, the afternoon sun throwing long gold light across the grass. Margaret's mind wouldn't settle. Kept circling the same handful of facts, over and over, the way a hawk circles before it commits to a strike. Thaddeus Bell, her father, framed 19 years ago. Cole Vance, now Garrison Vance, the man who framed him. The man who'd built a fortune on stolen federal payroll and a lie that had cost her father everything. And somewhere in the middle of it, a mother named Ruth, who her father had believed dead for a quarter century, who might not be dead at all. You're quiet, Wyatt said, drawing his horse up alongside hers. Thinking about what the old ranger told you. She glanced at him. Something in his tone, casual, almost too casual, snagged at her attention. You heard all that? Cabin's got thin walls, Miss Colton. Wasn't trying to listen. Just did. He shrugged, easy, unbothered. Garrison Vance. Man's practically royalty round these parts. Everybody in 3 counties owes him money one way or another. Banks half his, feed stores half his. Even the church roof got fixed with his money 2 summers back, which means half the town's grateful to him, Margaret said slowly, and the other half's afraid of him. Same coin, most sometimes. Wyatt's eyes were on the trail ahead. Careful, unreasonable. You planning on doing something about all this? I'm planning on finding proof. Real proof. Something that can't be talked away or bought off or ignored by a Marshal. Too scared of his own mortgage to do his job. She set her jaw. My father spent 19 years hiding. I'm not going to spend the rest of mine doing the same. Wyatt was quiet a moment. Careful, Margaret, he said finally, and something in his voice had shifted, gone lower, more serious than she'd ever heard him. Men like Vance don't stay powerful by playing fair. You go poking at him direct. You're liable to get more than you bargained for. She didn't know it yet. Wouldn't know it for days. Wouldn't know it until the moment made it impossible to keep not knowing. But there was a particular weight to that warning. A weight that didn't come from simple concern. It came from a man who already knew exactly how dangerous the answer was going to be. Because he was the one who'd been reporting the questions. The proof, when it finally started surfacing, didn't come from digging in dark corners or breaking any locks. It came at first from something far more ordinary, far more human. Hattie Sims ran the dress shop on the corner of Larkspur Hollow's single real street, had run it for going on 20 years, and had outlived 2 husbands and buried more secrets about this town than the church confessional ever heard, mostly because women told Hattie things while she pinned their hems that they'd never tell a soul otherwise. Margaret found her there 2 days later, needle moving steady through blue calico, gray hair pinned tight under a cap, sharp eyes that missed nothing, despite the soft, grandmotherly set of her face. Heard about your pa, Hattie said before Margaret had even finished closing the door. Terrible thing. Terrible, he's recovering. Good, good. The needle didn't slow. You didn't come in for a dress fitting, child. Sit down. Tell old Hattie what's really eaten at you. Margaret sat, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that the whole story came pouring out of her. The badge, the box, Amos Tillman's grim account, the name Vance sitting like a stone in her chest. Hattie's needle finally stopped. Garrison Vance, she said slowly, and something crossed her weathered face that Margaret recognized, now recognized, because she'd started seeing it everywhere in this town's once she knew to look for it. Fear dressed up as caution. That's a name, folks. Round here learn young not to say too loud. Why? Hattie glanced toward the shop window, toward the empty street outside, before she answered a small, involuntary gesture, the kind a body makes without deciding to, born of long habit. Man owns near everything worth owning in this valley, she said quietly. But more than that, he's got Marshal Pratt eaten out of his hand, has for years. Everybody knows it. Nobody says it. Pratt's boys schooling back east? Vance pays for that, quiet-like. Through some arrangement nobody talks plain about. And it ain't just money, neither. Her voice dropped further. 2 years back, rancher name of Coates tried standing up to Vance over grazing rights. Coates' barn burned to the ground 1 week later. Nobody ever proved a thing. Nobody ever will. Margaret felt something settle into her chest. You're saying Marshal Pratt is working for Vance? Not the law. Vance. I'm saying, Hattie said carefully, that if you go looking for justice in this town, through the man wearing the star, child, you're liable to find yourself standing where Coates stood. And I don't imagine your father's farmhouse burns any less than Coates's barn did. The room was quiet a long moment. Outside, a wagon rolled past, ordinary and unhurried, and the whole strangeness of it struck Margaret at once how a town could go on being ordinary, day after day, while corruption sat coiled underneath it, like a snake in tall grass, patient, unseen, waiting. Then I need proof that doesn't run through the Marshal at all, Margaret said slowly. Something solid enough that even Pratt can't ignore it. Something that proves Vance was behind what happened to my father 19 years ago and 3 nights ago, both. Hattie studied her a long moment, then reached over, patted her hand once, gentle and rough at the same time. Vance keeps a ledger, she said quietly. Every rancher, every merchant, every debt in this valley, all of it written down in a study at his house, locked up tight as a bank vault. My sister does his laundry, has for years. She says he never lets a soul near that room. Not his foreman, not his own kin. A pause. If there's proof of what he did to your pa, child, that's likely where it's kept. She saw Garrison Vance in person for the first time, 3 days later, on the boardwalk outside the bank, and the sight of him nearly stopped her breath, because she'd built a monster in her mind over the past week, a shadow, a name whispered in fear. And what stood on the boardwalk, instead, was an ordinary-looking man in his late 50s, silver-templed, well-dressed in a dark wool coat and a string tie, with the kind of easy, practiced smile that men wear when they've spent decades being the most powerful person in every room they enter. He didn't look like a monster. That, Margaret understood in the space of one held breath, was exactly the point. Miss Colton. He tipped his hat, courteous, unhurried, as though they'd been introduced at a church social rather than standing on opposite ends of a debt 19 years buried. Heard about the trouble at your place. Terrible business. Territory's not what it used to be. Her whole body wanted to react, wanted her hand to find the grip of her father's Colt, wanted her voice to accuse, to shout, to demand he account for every single thing Amos Tillman had told her in that quiet cabin. She did none of it. Because some cold, careful part of her, the same part her father had spent 25 years building, without ever naming what he was building, understood, instantly, that showing her hand now would cost her everything. Terrible business, she agreed instead, and made herself smile, small and polite. My father's recovering. Thank you for asking. Glad to hear it. Vance's eyes lingered on her, a half-second too long, assessing, measuring. The way a man measures a fence line he's deciding whether to cross. Your father and I go back further than you might think, Miss Colton. Small territory. Old friends turn up in the strangest places. The words landed like a blade, slid quiet between her ribs. He knew, not suspected, knew exactly who Franklin Colton really was, knew exactly who she was. and had just told her so plain, smiling, standing in broad daylight on Larkspur Hollow's only real street, with the calm certainty of a man who believed himself entirely untouchable. "Is that so?" she managed. "It is." He tipped his hat again, that same easy smile never wavering. "You give your father my regards, Miss Colton. Tell him an old friend's thinking of him." He walked on before she could answer, and Margaret stood rooted to the boardwalk, heart hammering, watching his broad back disappear into the bank, and understood with sudden, total clarity that the war her father had spent 19 years hiding from had just, very quietly, very politely, declared itself in the open. That night, at the farmhouse, she laid it all out for Amos Tillman across the same kitchen table, where the badge and the torn photograph still sat like evidence waiting for a trial that would never be fair enough to hold. "He knows I know," she said. "Told me himself, plain as day, standing right there on the street." "Man like Vance," Amos said grimly, "doesn't hide a threat once he's decided you're not worth pretending for anymore. That's not confidence, Margaret. That's a warning. Then we don't wait for him to send the next 5 riders." Her jaw set hard. "We go first. Hattie says he records a ledger, proof of every crooked debt and every arrangement in this valley, locked in a study at his ranch house. If there's anything left from 19 years ago, any paper trail connecting him to the frame job, to my father, that's where it'll be." "Breaking into Garrison Vance's house," Amos said slowly, "is a fine way to end up buried next to Coates's barn. I know the risk." "Do you?" His pale eyes held hers, steady, serious. "Because I knew your father when he was Thaddeus Bell, Margaret. Knew him young and reckless, and certain the world owed truth a fair hearing. Watched what it cost him to learn different." He leaned forward. "You go advance direct, you'd best go smart. Not brave. Smart." She thought of her father lying upstairs, still weak, still healing, a man who'd spent 19 years choosing quiet over justice to keep her safe. She thought of the shattered box on the hearthstone. She thought of a name, Ruth, that might still be out there somewhere, alive, waiting 19 years, for a truth that never came. "Then help me be smart," she said, "because I'm going with or without it." Amos studied her a long moment. Then slowly, he nodded. "Vance's ranch sits 8 miles north," he said. "Big house, foreman's quarters, bunkhouse for maybe a dozen hands. Studies on the east side, ground floor if my memory of the place from years back still holds true. Man like that keeps night riders on patrol, but he's grown fat and comfortable in 19 years of nobody challenging him. Comfortable men grow careless." A grim, humorless smile. "We go 2 nights from now. New moon. Dark enough to move unseen. If we're careful." "We," Margaret repeated. "You didn't think I was going to let Thaddeus Bell's daughter walk into that alone, did you?" Amos's voice was gruff, but something warmer moved underneath it. "Man was near a brother to me once, in a life neither one of us gets back. Least I can do is watch your back gettin' what's owed him." 2 nights later, under a sky black and starless with the new moon, Margaret Colton rode north with Amos Tillman on one side and Wyatt Cross on the other, 3 shapes moving quiet across open range toward the lights of the Vance ranch house, glowing faint and distant on the dark horizon. She'd left her father sleeping. A note on the kitchen table saying only that she'd gone to check on a sick neighbor's cattle, a small lie. The first real lie she'd ever told him. And it sat uneasy in her chest the whole ride out. But some truths she was learning fast needed to be found before they could safely be shared. The Vance spread announced itself long before they reached it, miles of fenced grazing land, cattle dark shapes against darker grass, a main house built grand and columned in a style that looked almost out of place on the Wyoming plain, as though a man had tried to drag a piece of some finer world out here and plant it in dirt that didn't want it. They left the horses tied in a stand of cottonwoods a quarter mile out and went the rest of the way on foot, low and silent, the way her father had drilled into her 100 times, behind their own barn, move like the land itself. Don't fight the shadows. Let them hide you. The bunkhouse windows glowed amber with lamplight. Laughter drifted faint on the night air, a dozen hired hands settling into cards and whiskey after a long day's work, none of them looking toward the dark eastern side of the main house, where a single window burned low behind heavy curtains. "That's the study," Amos breathed, barely a whisper. "Same as I remember. Guards? One walk in the porch, far as I can tell. Comfortable men grow careless, like I said." His eyes glittered faint in the starlight. "But careless ain't the same as unguarded. Move quiet. They moved quiet. Margaret's heart hammered a steady, controlled rhythm in her chest, not the wild panic of the night the riders had come, but something colder, sharper, the particular focus her father had spent a lifetime carving into her, without either of them ever calling it what it truly was, training for exactly this. A single guard paced the porch's edge, rifle slung lazy over one shoulder, more bored than watchful, and she and Amos slipped along the tree line's shadow until they reached the study's east-facing window. Wyatt stayed back with the horses. That detail would matter later, would matter more than Margaret could have possibly understood. In that moment, crouched in cold Wyoming dirt with her heart in her throat and her whole future balanced on the edge of a window latch, the window gave with barely a whisper, unlatched, careless in exactly the way Amos had predicted. Margaret slid through first, dropped soft onto a Persian rug that felt obscenely out of place under her worn boots, and found herself standing in a room that told her everything about the kind of man Garrison Vance had become. Dark wood paneling, a massive oak desk, shelves lined with leather-bound books that looked too pristine to have ever been read. And on the wall behind the desk, in a heavy gilt frame, a portrait of Vance himself younger, but unmistakably, him standing beside a woman Margaret didn't recognize, and a boy of perhaps 10, all three of them dressed in the kind of finery that stolen federal payroll could buy 19 years' worth of. Amos slipped through the window behind her, quiet as a shadow, and together they moved to the desk. Ledger, he breathed. Has to be here somewhere. They found it in the third drawer down, locked, but the lock gave way easy under the thin blade Amos produced from his boot, the practiced, unhurried motion of a man who'd picked more locks in his lifetime than he'd probably admit to in polite company. The ledger was thick, leather-bound, pages of tight, careful handwriting recording debts, favors, arrangements stretching back years, names Margaret recognized from Larkspur Hollow's storefronts and pews, each one bound to Garrison Vance by threads of money and obligation that ran deeper than any of them likely wanted known. But it was the older entries that stopped her breath entirely. Near the very back, in ink faded almost to brown, a different hand had recorded a different set of entries, smaller, more careful, the writing of a younger, more cautious man building a lie he intended to keep buried forever. Payments made to men whose names Margaret didn't know. A date 19 years past. A single line, chilling in its plainness. T-Bell matter resolved permanently. No further complications expected. Beside it, tucked between two pages like a bookmark left there and forgotten, a folded document old, official, bearing a federal seal gone brittle with age. A confession, unsigned, drafted in Garrison Vance's own careful hand, admitting in cold legal language to the theft of a federal payroll and the deliberate framing of a deputy United States Marshal named Thaddeus Bell, unsigned. But unmistakably his handwriting, matched line for line against a dozen other entries in the ledger surrounding it. Margaret's hands shook holding it, because here it was, 19 years of buried truth, sitting in her two hands, proof enough to unmake the whole comfortable lie Garrison Vance had built his fortune upon. We've got it, she breathed. Amos, we've got it. Then let's not press our luck. His voice was tight, urgent now. Fold it small. Inside your coat. We move now. They were halfway to the window when the guard's boots changed rhythm on the porch outside. A pause, then a quickening, then a voice raised, sharp and sudden, into the night. Somebody's in the study! Get the boss! Get the boss! Everything happened at once. They hit the window in a scramble, Amos first, Margaret right behind him with the confession pressed flat against her ribs inside her coat, and the night that had been so quiet, so patient, so carefully theirs, tore open into chaos. Shouts from the bunkhouse, boots hitting dirt, a lamp flaring to life somewhere behind them, throwing long gold light across the grass just as Margaret's feet hit the ground running. This way, Amas's voice, low and urgent, cutting through the noise. Horses! Move! She moved, ran full out, across open ground with her heart slamming and her lungs burning. Every lesson her father had ever drilled into her firing, at once: don't look back, don't slow down. A moving target lives longer than a brave one, and behind her the shouts multiplied, more voices joining the first, a rifle shot cracking wild and wide into the darkness. They reached the cottonwoods, reached the horses. Wyatt already had them untied, already mounted. Face pale and tight in the starlight. What happened? He demanded. No time. Margaret swung up into her saddle, the confession still pressed tight against her ribs. Ride! They rode. Behind them, the Vance ranch erupted into full alarm. Lanterns bobbing, shouts carrying across open range, and Margaret risked one glance back to see a dozen riders pouring out from the bunkhouse, dark shapes against the lit windows. Mounting fast, coming on hard. They're behind us, Wyatt shouted. I know, Amos's voice grim. Ride for the creek crossing. Water'll break our trail. They rode hard through the dark, the ground blurring beneath them, the sound of pursuit never quite fading, never quite closing. A terrible, steady presence at their backs, the entire desperate length of that ride. Margaret's mind raced even as her body focused entirely on staying mounted, staying moving, staying alive. Because they had it. The proof. 19 years of lies finally cracked open, folded against her heart, which meant Garrison Vance was about to become the most dangerous man in Wyoming Territory. Because a man with everything to lose does not stop chasing the thing that can take it all away. They reached the creek crossing as the first gray hint of false dawn touched the eastern sky. Horses lathered and blowing hard, and for one brief, aching moment, Margaret let herself believe they'd made it clean. Let herself believe the worst of the night was behind them. She was wrong. The ambush came a mile past the crossing, in a narrow stretch of trail where the land folded down into a shallow draw, thick with brush and boulder, the kind of ground a rider chooses when he wants to disappear into it, or the kind of ground a man chooses when he wants to trap something inside it. The first shot took Amos's hat clean off his head. Down, he roared, already wheeling his horse hard toward what little cover the draw offered. Ambush! Take cover! Margaret's horse screamed and reared as gunfire erupted from both sides of the trail. At once muzzle flashes, strobing bright and violent in the gray pre-dawn light, and she threw herself from the saddle a half second before a second volley tore through the space where she'd been sitting. She hit the ground rolling, came up behind a boulder with her father's Colt already in her hand, heart slamming, mind racing through every lesson, every drill, every quiet Sunday afternoon that had built toward exactly this moment, because this wasn't random. This wasn't bad luck on a dark trail. This was an ambush, planned, positioned, waiting for them at exactly the point where they'd have to cross, which meant someone had known which way they'd ride, which meant someone had known when. The thought arrived cold and terrible, even as her hands worked automatically, returning fire, counting shots, tracking movement in the brush the way her father had taught her to track anything patient, precise, controlled even under fire. Amos, she called out, low, urgent. You hit? Grazed, I'm all right. His voice came from somewhere to her left, tight with pain but steady. Wyatt, where the question died in his throat. Because in the strengthening gray light, Margaret could see him now, could see Wyatt cross, not pinned down behind cover like the rest of them, not fighting for his life in the brush, standing in the open, hands raised, walking calmly toward the ridge where the gunfire was coming from, and one of the shadowed riders up there lowered his weapon at Wyatt's approach instead of firing. Lowered it, because he recognized him. Wyatt? Margaret's voice came out strangled, disbelieving, even as some cold part of her mind was already assembling the pieces, the familiar quiet in the way the first riders had moved that terrible night at the farmhouse, the tightness around his eyes these past days, the careful, casual way he'd always seemed to know just a little more than he should. Wyatt, what are you doing? He turned back toward her, just once, across the widening gray distance between them, and even from here she could see something break across his face. Not triumph, not cruelty, something that looked sickeningly like regret. I'm sorry, Margaret, he called out, his voice carrying flat and hollow across the draw. I never wanted it to come to this, but Vance owns the note on my family's old land. Has for 2 years, said he'd forgive the whole debt if I just told him things. Where you were riding, what you were planning. His voice cracked on the last word. I didn't know they'd shoot your pa. I swear before God I didn't know that part. The betrayal landed harder than any bullet had come close to that whole terrible morning. Because she'd trusted him. Because he'd slept in their bunkhouse, eaten at their table, fought beside her the very night the box had shattered, driving off the same men he'd apparently been reporting to all along. Because trust, she was learning in the space of one broken heartbeat, was the most dangerous currency a person could spend in a war they didn't know they were fighting. Amos's voice, raw with fury, cut off sharp as gunfire, erupted again from the ridge, fresh and renewed, driving them both back down hard behind cover. "They're closing in," Amos shouted over the noise. "Margaret, we can't hold this position much longer. We're outnumbered and outpositioned, and now they know exactly where we—" The rest of his words were swallowed by another volley. Closer this time, bullets chewing splinters off the boulder inches from Margaret's head, and through the chaos and the noise and the terrible clarity of understanding exactly how thoroughly they'd been betrayed, one single thought burned clear and cold at the center of everything. They had the confession. They had 19 years of buried truth folded against her heart, and now Garrison Vance's men had them pinned down in a draw at first light, with the one man they'd trusted enough to bring along standing on the ridge above them, having led them, step by careful step, exactly where his new master wanted them. Margaret checked her father's Colt. 3 rounds left in the cylinder. She thought of the badge, tarnished silver, worn smooth by a young man's nervous hands 20 years before she was born. She thought of her father's whispered voice in the dark. "Whoever comes hunting, you don't go at this alone." She'd broken that promise the moment she'd needed to. But she wasn't broken yet. Not while there was still breath in her lungs and rounds left in the chamber, and a truth worth more than her own life folded safe against her heart. "Amos," she called out, steady despite everything, steady the way 25 years of quiet Sunday lessons had built her to be steady. "On my mark, we move for the rocks upslope. Cover me." "Margaret, that's open ground. They'll cut you down before." "They want the confession alive," she said, grim certainty settling cold and clear through her whole body. "Which means they want me alive, too. At least until they've got it back." Which meant she had one advantage left in a morning that had taken every other one away from her. They needed her breathing. For now. Above them on the ridge, gunfire echoed on across the gray Wyoming dawn, and somewhere behind that gunfire, a man who used to call her friend watched the trap he'd helped build, finally close, around the only family that had ever taken him in. 3 rounds left. She counted them the way her father taught her to count anything that might mean the difference between living and not living quiet. Exact. No room for hope to fudge the number, because hope got people killed. Her father used to say that too. Hope is what a man feels right before he stops paying attention. She wasn't going to stop paying attention. The ridge above the draw kept spitting fire, muzzle flashes strobing pale against the graying sky, and Amos Tillman was down behind a boulder, 6 feet to her left, with blood soaking dark through his shoulder and a rifle still steady in his good hand. And, somewhere up on that ridge, stood a man who used to eat supper at her table. Wyatt. She wasn't going to think about Wyatt right now. Couldn't afford to. Grief was a luxury same as panic was, and her father had taught her both those lessons in the same careful breath, years ago, behind a barn that had never once been about wolves. "Margaret." Amos's voice tight with pain, urgent under it. "That confession still on you?" "Against my ribs. Won't leave me unless they cut it off my body." "Then that's exactly what they're going to try." He fired once, ducked back down as an answer cracked off the rock beside his head. "They want it back more than they want us dead. Which buys us maybe one clean shot at getting out of here before somebody up there decides dead's easier than careful." Because that was the arithmetic of the whole terrible morning, wasn't it? A confession worth more than 2 lives. At least for now. At least until Vance decided the risk of keeping them breathing outweighed the risk of what they might do with what they knew. "On my count," Margaret said. 3, 2. The world exploded sideways instead. Not gunfire. Not from the ridge. From behind them, from the brush at the mouth of the draw, a new voice cut through the chaos. A woman's voice, sharp and commanding and utterly unexpected, and 3 fast shots rang out in quick, precise succession, and up on the ridge 2 of the shadowed riders went down hard and stayed down. "Move!" the voice shouted. "Now, while you've got the chance." Margaret didn't have time to wonder, didn't have time to do anything except grab Amos by his good arm and half drag him up and running. the two of them scrambling low and fast toward the source of that voice, toward a stand of cottonwoods where a lone rider sat mounted with a rifle still smoking in her gloved hands. A woman, middle-aged, maybe near 50, weathered and lean in a way that spoke of years spent outdoors, rather than years spent behind a shop counter. Gray threading heavy through hair the color of dark honey, pulled back tight under a wide-brimmed hat, and eyes pale gray-blue eyes that hit Margaret like a physical blow the instant they met hers, because she knew those eyes. She'd seen them every single morning of her life. In the mirror. "Get on," the woman said, voice steady despite the chaos still erupting behind them, reaching down a hand toward Margaret even as she kept her rifle trained one-handed back toward the ridge. "There's no time. Get on now." Margaret didn't move. Couldn't move. Her whole body had gone strange and distant, disconnected from the gunfire, from Amos bleeding beside her, from every single thing except the impossible face looking down at her from horseback. "Who?" The word came out broken. "Who are you?" Something passed across the woman's weathered face. Grief and hope tangled together so tight they were indistinguishable from each other. "There's time for that later," she said, voice cracking despite its steadiness. "Right now I need you alive to hear it. Get on." The urgency in it broke whatever had frozen Margaret's legs. She grabbed the offered arm, swung up behind the saddle, and Amos was hauled up onto a second horse that materialized from the cottonwood shadows led. Margaret realized dimly, by a third figure she hadn't even registered until now, an older man with a weathered face and a Winchester across his lap, watching this ridge with the flat calm of someone who'd done this kind of work his whole life. They rode. Behind them, gunfire chased for 100 yards, 200, and then began to fall away as the ground dropped and folded, and the woman leading them cut a path Margaret would never in 1,000 years have found on her own through a dry wash. Along a fence line hidden by brush, over a low ridge that put a wall of stone and timber between them and the men still searching the draw for something they'd already lost. They didn't stop for nearly 4 miles. When they finally did, in a hidden hollow ringed by cottonwood and boulder, a place clearly chosen because it couldn't be seen from any road, Margaret slid down off the horse on legs that didn't feel entirely like her own and turned to face the woman who'd just saved her life. Up close, in the strengthening morning light, the resemblance was unbearable. The line of the jaw, the particular set of the mouth when it was trying not to shake. "Say it," Margaret whispered. "Whoever you are, say it out loud so I know I'm not imagining this." The woman's composure, that hard, weathered, rifle-steady composure, finally cracked straight down the middle. "My name is Ruth," she said, and her voice broke apart on the second word. "Ruth Bell. I'm your mother, Margaret, and I have spent 25 years believing you were dead, the same way your father spent 25 years believing the same thing about me." They didn't speak for a long moment after that. Couldn't. There wasn't language built for a moment like that, a mother and daughter standing 8 feet apart in a hidden Wyoming hollow with a quarter-century of stolen time between them. Both of them frozen. Both of them afraid that moving might somehow prove it wasn't real. Amos broke the silence first, wincing as the older man introduced, simply as Silas, a name Margaret would learn, later belonged to one of Ruth's few trusted hands pressed afield, dressing hard against the wound in his shoulder. "Ruth Bell," Amos said slowly, disbelief and something like joy fighting for space in his gravel voice. "God almighty! 19 years and here you are! Amos Tillman." Ruth's eyes found him, and something warm and grieving moved across her face. "You haven't aged a day, which is either a blessing or a lie, and I've stopped being able to tell the difference at my age." "How?" Margaret finally found her voice, though it came out thin, uncertain. "How are you alive? Pa believed he told me he never knew. Never let himself hope that you'd died." Ruth's jaw tightened. That's what Cole wanted him to believe. Wanted everyone to believe. Easier to bury a lie completely than to leave loose threads that might one day get pulled. "Cole," Margaret repeated slowly. And something cold moved through her chest, even before Ruth finished the thought, some instinct already assembling pieces her conscious mind hadn't caught up to yet. "Cole Vance," Ruth said. "Garrison Vance now. My brother." The word landed like a physical blow. Because of course it did. Because nothing about this whole terrible, unraveling truth had been simple. And why would this be any different? The man who'd framed her father, stolen his name, hunted him across 19 years and 200 miles, turned out to be blood kin to the mother Margaret, had spent her whole life believing dead. Your brother, Margaret said, very quietly. Garrison Vance is your brother. Was my brother. Ruth's voice had gone hard now. Flint striking Flint. The man I grew up with died the day he let his partner take the blame for a crime he committed. Whatever wears his face now, whatever walks around this territory, calling itself Garrison Vance, and buying up half of Wyoming with stolen federal money that's not my brother anymore. That's just a debt that's been coming due for 19 years, same as everyone else's. They rode to Ruth's small, hidden homestead deeper into the foothills, a place tucked so carefully into the landscape that Margaret understood immediately why nobody had ever found her in 19 years of searching that never quite happened, because her father had never let himself search at all, too certain, too broken, too afraid of hope proving false a second time. Inside, over strong coffee and bread still warm from the morning fire, Ruth told the rest of it. Told it slow. Told it careful. The way a person tells a story they've rehearsed 1,000 times alone in the dark, never once expecting an audience. Cole and I grew up dirt poor in Missouri, she began. Our father drank away every dollar he ever made, and Cole swore from the time he was 12 years old that he'd never live poor again, whatever it cost him. I loved my brother Margaret, loved him fierce, the way you love the person who protected you when nobody else did. But there was always something underneath that loved something hungry, something that got worse instead of better as he got older. When did you meet Pa? Kansas. Dodge City, near enough. Thaddeus was Cole's partner, by then federal marshals, the both of them. And Thaddeus was everything Cole pretended to be, but wasn't. Steady, honest to a fault. I fell for him within a season, married him within a year, and for a little while, her voice caught, steadied. For a little while, it was the best any of us ever had it. Then the payroll robbery, Margaret said quietly. Ruth nodded, slow, grim. Cole had debts, gambling debts mostly, though I didn't know the full extent till much later. He arranged the robbery himself, hired the men, planned the route, made off with a quarter of a federal payroll shipment. And when the investigation started closing in, he made certain every piece of evidence pointed at your father instead. Her hands tightened around her coffee cup. I found out the truth 3 days before they came to kill him. Confronted Cole myself, begged him to make it right. What did he say? Ruth's eyes went distant, dark with a memory 2 decades old and still sharp enough to cut. He told me family looked after family, she said quietly. Told me if I loved him, I'd stay quiet and let an old friend take a fall neither one of us could afford for him to escape. And when I told him I'd rather lose a brother than watch an innocent man hang for his crime, she stopped, breathed, continued. He had me taken. Held somewhere I never even learned the name of for nearly 2 years, until word finally reached him that Thaddeus and the baby had disappeared entirely, presumed dead in a river crossing gone wrong. Only then did Cole finally let me go. Told me there was nothing left worth running back to. Told me my husband and my daughter were both already in the ground. The room was silent a long moment. I believed him, Ruth said, very quiet now, the words costing her something visible. God forgive me. Margaret, I believed my own brother, over the possibility that my husband might still be alive somewhere. Hiding, waiting, hoping. I spent 19 years believing I had nothing left to search for. Built this life out here alone, because grief seemed easier to carry in silence than in company. Her eyes lifted, wet, unbearably direct. Until 3 days ago, when word reached me through people I still trust in this territory that Thaddeus Bell's farm had been hit by riders looking for a box. And I understood, all at once, that everything Cole told me 25 years ago had been exactly what it always is. A lie, Margaret finished. A lie, Ruth agreed. Built the same careful way he's built every lie since. Which is why I've spent the last 3 days finding you, Margaret. Because I wasn't going to lose what's left of my family a second time to my brother's cowardice. They rode back toward the Colton farm together at dusk, Ruth and Margaret side by side for the first time in 25 years, Amos trailing behind, with his shoulder bandaged tight, and the whole ride passed in a silence that wasn't empty, so much as full of everything 25 years apart doesn't leave room to say all at once. Franklin Colton was sitting up in bed when they arrived, stronger now. Color returned to his face. and Margaret watched from the bedroom doorway as her father's eyes found the woman standing beside her, and every single thing he'd built himself into over 19 years of careful, quiet hiding came apart in a single unguarded moment. Ruth. Just her name. The same way he'd said it, fevered and half-conscious, the night the box shattered on the hearthstone. Ruth crossed the room without a word and took his outstretched hand in both of hers, and Margaret quietly stepped back out into the hallway to give them what privacy the small farmhouse could offer, her own eyes stinging in a way she hadn't expected and didn't entirely know how to name. She heard her father's voice, rough, broken. "I told her you were dead." "I told her the same about you," Ruth answered. "Just as broken. We were both lied to by the same man, Thaddeus, and we've both spent 19 years paying for a crime neither of us committed. I should have looked for you. Should have never stopped believing. You had a daughter to protect. So did I, once, until Cole made certain I believed she was already gone." A long pause. "We don't have to spend what left forgiving ourselves for choices made under a lie, Thaddeus. We have to spend it making certain he never gets to build another one." Margaret, standing in the hallway with the confession still folded against her ribs, understood with sudden and total clarity that the reunion happening in that bedroom was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of the reckoning. They gathered at the kitchen table that night, Franklin propped up in a chair, despite Doc Holloway's certain objections, had he been present to voice them. Ruth beside him, Margaret across from both of them, Amos standing by the stove with his bandaged shoulder and his rifle never far from reach. The confession sat in the center of the table, like something radioactive. 19 years of buried truth, folded and worn now from the ride, but still entirely legible, still entirely damning. "It's not enough," Franklin said finally, studying the unsigned document with a lawman's cold, careful eye, despite the tremor still in his hands. "A confession without his signature. A ledger we can't produce as evidence without admitting we stole it from his house in the dead of night. Any territorial judge worth his benches is going to want more than this before he issues a warrant against the wealthiest man in 3 counties. Then we get more," Margaret said. "How?" Ruth's voice was sharp, protective, a mother's fear, finding its footing fast after 25 years of dormancy. "You've already been ambushed once, Margaret. Shot at. Betrayed by a man you trusted under your own roof. How many more times do you intend to walk back into that fire before it finally catches you?" "As many times as it takes." The words came out flat, certain, and something in her father's face, watching her say them, shifted into an expression Margaret had never seen there before, not fear exactly, though fear was in it too. Recognition. The particular, aching pride of a man watching everything he'd carefully built, finally, terribly, come fully alive. "She's got your stubbornness," Ruth murmured to Franklin, half a smile breaking through the grief on her face despite everything. "God help us all." "She's got more than that," Franklin said quietly, eyes never leaving his daughter's face. "She's got everything I ever taught her, and every reason in the world to use it. I just prayed she'd never have to." Well, Margaret's jaw was set, steady, the same steadiness that had carried her through gunfire and betrayal. And a mother returned from the dead in the space of a single impossible week. "Prayers don't always get answered the way we want them to, Pa. Sometimes the only way through is straight ahead. Then we go about it right," Franklin said, and something of the old lawman surfaced in his voice, tired, wounded, but unmistakably present. "Not sneaking through windows in the dead of night. Not chasing shadows on dark trails where Vance's men can pick their ground and their moment. We go to the territorial court in Cheyenne, lay every piece of proof we have before a federal judge, and force this reckoning into the daylight, where a man like Garrison Vance can't buy his way out of it quiet. That'll take days," Amos said. "Maybe a week, riding there and back with proper representation. Vance'll have time to cover his tracks. Might even have time to come after us again before we ever reach Cheyenne. Then we don't give him the choice." Margaret's mind was already working, already assembling the shape of something bold enough to match everything they'd survived to get here. "We send word to the territorial marshal directly, not through Pratt, who's compromised, and we force Vance into a confrontation on our terms, in front of witnesses he can't silence and evidence he can't burn." "That's a fine plan," Amos said slowly, "assuming Garrison Vance agrees to stand still long enough for it to work." "He will," Ruth said quietly, and every head in the room turned toward her. Because there's one thing about my brother none of you know yet. One thing I only learned myself these past few years, watching him from a careful distance, waiting for the courage to come back into the light. What's that? Franklin asked. Ruth's face had gone strange, grim and sad at once, an expression that seemed to carry more weight than simple hatred for a man who'd so much from so many. Cole is dying, she said quietly. Has been for near a year now. Doc in Cheyenne confirmed it to my own physician in confidence. Months back, some sickness in his lungs that no medicine's slowing down. He's got months left. Maybe less. Her eyes moved slowly around the table. Which means whatever this is, whatever he's trying to bury by hunting you both down after 19 years of silence, it isn't only about protecting his fortune anymore. What is it about then? Margaret asked, though something cold in her chest already suspected the answer before Ruth spoke it. It's about dying with the lie intact, Ruth said softly. About making certain the world remembers Garrison Vance as a respected man of means, instead of the truth of what Cole Vance really was. A man running out of time doesn't fight for money anymore, Margaret. He fights for the only thing he's got left to lose. The kitchen went very quiet, because that changed everything. A desperate man with everything to lose was dangerous in one particular, predictable way. A dying man with nothing left to lose, but his name was something else entirely unpredictable. Willing to burn down anything and anyone standing between himself and a legacy he could no longer control any other way. Then we don't have days, Franklin said slowly. We don't have a week to ride to Cheyenne and back. No, Ruth agreed grimly. We don't. They rode for the Vance Ranch 2 mornings later, not in secret this time, not under cover of darkness, but openly, deliberately, in full daylight along the main road. 5 riders moving with purpose toward a confrontation none of them could avoid any longer. Franklin rode despite Doc Holloway's furious protests, upright and pale but steady in the saddle, his old Winchester across his lap, for the first time in 19 years worn openly instead of hidden. Ruth rode beside him, rifle at the ready. 25 years of quiet grief, burning now into something harder and more useful. Amos rode with his shoulders still bound tight, but his aim as steady as ever. And Margaret rode at the front, her father's Colt on her hip, the unsigned confession secured safe inside a leather satchel, riding toward the man who had destroyed her family before she'd ever been old enough to understand what family even meant. She had sent word ahead, through a rider Amos trusted absolutely, to the territorial marshal's office in Cheyenne, laying out everything: the confession, the ledger's damning entries, the 19-year-old frame job, the attempted murder just days past. A federal deputy was riding to meet them even now, though whether he'd arrive in time was a question none of them could answer, which meant, if it came to it, they would have to hold the line themselves until help arrived. The Vance Ranch looked different in daylight than it had that terrible night, less menacing, more ordinary, sprawling and grand, and utterly unremarkable, except for the dozen armed men who materialized along the fence line the moment their small party came into view. A rider broke away from the group and cantered out to meet them, rifle held loose but ready. That's far enough, he called out. Mr. Vance ain't expecting company? He'll want to make time for this company, Margaret called back, steady, unflinching. Tell him Thaddeus Bell rides with his daughter and his sister both, and we've come to settle a 19-year-old debt in full daylight in front of every witness this territory cares to send. The rider's face went through several things at once: confusion, then recognition, then something that looked distinctly like fear, before he wheeled his horse and rode hard back toward the main house. They waited. Long minutes passed, the sun climbing higher, sweat gathering under Margaret's collar despite the cool October air, every second stretching thin and taut across the open ground between them and the ranch house's grand columned porch. Then the front door opened, and Garrison Vance stepped out into the daylight to face the ghosts of everyone he'd wronged. He looked different up close, in full daylight, than he had that easy, courteous meeting on the boardwalk. Thinner than she remembered from just a week before. Pallor, despite the tan that years of ranch ownership had given him. And there was something in the way he moved now, something careful and effortful, that spoke plainly of the illness. Ruth had described a body beginning, however slowly, to fail the ambition that had driven it for so many decades. He stopped at the top of the porch steps, flanked by 2 of his men, and his eyes moved slowly across the 5 riders facing him. Franklin, Ruth, Amos, Margaret. Something in his face, seeing his sister alive after 19 years, cracked just for a moment, just enough to show the man underneath the fortune before he closed it back down hard. Ruth, he said, and his voice wasn't quite steady. I thought you thought I was gone. Ruth cut in, flat and cold. Same as you told my husband. Same lie, wearing 2 different faces, told to 2 different people you claimed to love. I did what I had to do. Something defensive rose fast in his voice. Old habit, surfacing instant and automatic. You don't understand what those years were like, Ruth. What it cost to build all this from nothing. From nothing. Franklin's voice, weak but unmistakably present, cut through the exchange like a blade. You built this from a federal payroll you stole and a lie you let cost me everything, Cole. 19 years of hiding. 19 years of raising my daughter under a false name because you made certain the whole world believed Thaddeus Bell was already dead. Vance's jaw tightened. You could have stayed dead, he said quietly. Would have been easier for everyone if you had. Easier for you, Margaret said, her voice cutting clear and hard across the space between them, and Vance's eyes finally settled on her, really settled, taking in for the first time not the farm girl he'd underestimated, but the woman standing before him now with her father's steadiness and her mother's fire both burning in her face at once. You sent men to my home, shot my father nearly dead, tore apart the only life I ever knew, all to protect a lie you've been carrying for 2 decades. And you never once considered that the girl you were trying to erase had spent her whole life being trained, without ever knowing why, for exactly this moment. A moment that ends the same way it would have ended 19 years ago. Vance said, and something cold slid back into his voice, the old ruthlessness surfacing beneath the illness and the guilt. You think I don't have men enough here to finish what got started at your farmhouse? You think 5 riders was the whole of what I'm capable of? I think, Margaret said, holding up the leather satchel for every man on that porch and every man watching from the fence line to see that a federal deputy is riding from Cheyenne right now with a warrant already drawn because I sent word 2 days ago, laying out exactly what's inside this satchel. Your own handwriting, Mr. Vance. An unsigned confession admitting to theft and to the deliberate frame-up of a United States Marshal. A ledger recording payments to hired men, dated the same week my father was nearly killed. Enough proof to hang a man of any fortune, in any territory, in front of any judge honest enough to read it plain. Vance went very still. You broke into my home. You broke into mine first, Margaret said. Shattered a box that held 19 years of my father's stolen life inside it. I'd say we're square on trespass, Mr. Vance, considering everything else you owe. For a long moment, nobody moved. The morning wind carried dust across the open yard between them, and somewhere behind Vance, one of his men shifted his weight, rifle tightening in his grip, waiting for a word that would tip the whole scene into violence. Then Garrison Vance did something none of them expected. He laughed. It wasn't a good laugh. Hollow and tired and edged with something close to despair, the laugh of a man who had spent his whole life staying one careful step ahead of a reckoning he'd always known, somewhere underneath the fortune and the fine wool coats, would eventually catch him. You want to know something funny, Thaddeus, he said, turning toward the pale, weakened man on horseback, who used to be his closest friend in the world. I'm dying. Have been for the better part of a year now. Doctors give me till spring, if I'm fortunate. If I'm not, sooner. His eyes moved slow across the 5 faces watching him. I told myself, when word came that riders had missed the mark on your farm, that I still had time to fix it clean, bury the box for good this time. Make certain whatever proof you'd kept hidden all these years went into the ground with you, instead of us standing here, in my own front yard, in broad daylight, staring me down. And now? Ruth's voice was quiet, almost, despite everything, almost gentle. Vance's shoulders sagged, just slightly, the fight going out of him in a way that looked less like surrender and more like exhaustion too deep to keep fighting through. Now I'm standing here looking at everyone I ever wronged, all gathered in one place, alive despite every single thing I did to make certain you weren't, a long, ragged breath. And I find I haven't got the strength left to keep pretending this ends any way, but the way it was always going to end. He didn't reach for a weapon. didn't give the order his men were plainly waiting for. Rifles half raised along the fence line, tension coiled tight enough to snap at the smallest provocation. Instead, Garrison Vance sat down heavy on the top porch step, an old, sick man in a fine coat that suddenly looked too large for the body wearing it, and put his face in his hands for a long, silent moment. "I was going to die with people believing I built all this myself," he said finally, voice muffled, broken in a way none of them had ever heard from him before. Believing Garrison Vance was a self-made man instead of a thief who let his best friend hang for his own cowardice. That was the last thing I had left to protect, Ruth. Not the money, not the land, just the name. What people would remember after I was gone. "And now?" Margaret asked, steady, though something in her had softened despite every reason it had not to. Vance lifted his head. His eyes, when they found hers, were wet an old man's eyes, tired past bearing, looking at a young woman who held the whole remaining shape of his life in a leather satchel across her saddle. "Now I suppose it doesn't much matter what I protect," he said quietly. "Dead men don't get to choose how they're remembered. Only living ones do. And I imagine my time for choosing anything ran out somewhere around the moment I let 5 hired guns ride onto your father's land." A long, unsteady breath. "Do what you came to do, Miss Colton. I won't raise a hand against it." The yard went utterly silent. Because this was the moment. The one every lesson behind that Wyoming barn, every quiet Sunday afternoon dressed up as chores, had been sailing toward without either Margaret or her father ever fully understanding it. Justice, sitting right in front of her, undefended, unarmed, entirely at her mercy. She thought of the scythe swept low against a horse's legs, thought of the man with the knife, driven back by a palm strike taught for wolves that had never once been about wolves, thought of her father bleeding on the floorboards, while a stranger raised a shattered box like a hammer. She thought, too, of what her father had whispered to her, fevered and weak, the very first night this had all begun. Some things you keep even when they hurt to keep. Her hand rested on the grip of the Colt at her hip. She didn't draw it. "Get up," she said instead, quiet, and something in her voice carried more weight than any gunshot could have. "You're not going to die on a porch step with a story people whisper about. For a generation, Mr. Vance, you're going to stand trial in front of a federal judge, with every piece of proof laid out plain for the whole territory to see." Her jaw tightened. "My father spent 19 years hiding because you made certain the truth would kill him faster than any bullet. I'm not going to give you the mercy of a quick end you clearly came out here half hoping for. You're going to live long enough to hear a courtroom say his name, his real name out loud, and know that everyone in this territory finally knows exactly what you did to earn everything you own." Vance stared up at her for a long, breathless moment. Then slowly, something like relief moved across his ravaged face, not the relief of a man escaping punishment, but the strange, exhausted relief of a man finally set down, a weight he'd been carrying so long, he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand without it. "Your father raised you right," he said quietly. "Better than I ever imagined possible, watching from a distance all these years, telling myself it didn't matter what became of Thaddeus Bell's daughter, so long as she never learned the truth." A broken, humorless smile. "Seems the truth found her anyway. Seems it always does, given enough time." The federal deputy arrived from Cheyenne 2 hours later, a lean, serious man named Coburn, who read through the confession and the recovered ledger pages with the careful, unhurried thoroughness of someone who understood exactly how much weight a case like this would carry once it reached a proper courtroom. Marshal Otis Pratt showed up not long after, summoned by riders sent ahead, and the look on his face, when he understood the full scope of what had finally come to light: federal proof. A deputy already dispatched from the territorial capital, his own name likely to surface in testimony about payments made, and questions never asked told Margaret everything she needed to know about how the rest of Otis Pratt's career in Larkspur Hollow was about to unfold. He didn't meet her eyes as Vance was placed under formal arrest. Some debts, Margaret understood watching him stand there, silent and ashen, didn't require a courtroom to collect. Shame paid its own kind of interest. Wyatt Cross they found 2 days later, in a boarding house outside Bell Creek, having fled the territory the moment word reached him that the ambush had failed and Ruth Bell had turned up alive to complicate every careful plan Vance had built. He didn't resist when Deputy Coburn took him into custody. Didn't say much of anything at all, in fact, except one thing. Offered, quiet and broken, to Margaret across the boarding house's narrow hallway, the last words she would ever hear him speak. "I never wanted your family hurt," he said. "I hope someday you believe that, even if you never forgive it." She didn't answer him. Some silences, she was learning, said everything that needed saying. The trial, when it finally convened before a territorial judge in Cheyenne some weeks later, lasted only 4 days. The evidence was too thorough, too damning, too carefully corroborated by Ruth's testimony and Amos Tillman's old ranger connections and Franklin Bell's own account, given at last in open court, under his real name for the first time in 19 years, for any verdict but one to emerge. Garrison Vance was found guilty on charges of theft of federal property, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit murder. Given his failing health, the judge handed down a sentence that would, in all likelihood, mean he'd spend whatever remained of his life behind federal walls rather than in the grand columned houses he'd built on stolen money. He didn't fight the verdict, didn't raise his voice once through the entire proceeding, sat instead with the strange, hollowed stillness of a man who had already, somewhere on his own front porch steps a few weeks before, accepted the ending that was always coming for him. Ruth attended every single day of the trial, sat in the front row, spine straight, watching her brother answer for a lifetime of choices that had cost her everything she loved. When it was over, when the sentence was finally read, she didn't cry, didn't celebrate either, just sat quiet a long moment, then rose and walked out of that courtroom without ever looking back. "He's still my brother," she told Margaret that evening. In the quiet of the boarding house they'd taken rooms in for the trial's duration, her voice thin but steady, somewhere underneath everything he became. "I don't imagine I'll ever stop grieving the boy who used to walk me to school in Missouri, even knowing everything the man he grew into did to us both." A long, tired breath. "Grief and justice aren't opposites, Margaret. I'm learning that slow, but I'm learning it." There was one more matter Margaret settled before they rode home. Quiet and private, spoken only once and never raised again. Standing outside the Cheyenne courthouse, watching workmen load the last of the trial documents into a wagon bound for the Territorial Archive, she turned to her father and told him she meant to keep the name Colton. Not because she was ashamed of Bell, she said, because Colton was the name of the girl who'd learned to swing a scythe and pack a wound and hold a family together on nothing but grit and half-understood lessons. Bell belonged to the truth. Colton belonged to her. Her father had studied her a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes, and then he'd nodded, slow, and told her a name a person chooses for themselves carries more weight than one a person's merely born to. That he understood exactly what she meant, but because he'd spent 19 years learning the same from the opposite direction. They rode home to Larkspur Hollow together, Franklin, Ruth, Margaret, Amos as a family reassembled from wreckage 19 years old, the Wyoming autumn deepening gold and copper around them the whole long ride back. The farmhouse looked smaller than Margaret remembered. Somehow, though nothing about it had changed except everything she now understood about the people who lived inside it. Wheat stubble stood pale in the north field where she'd been standing, scythe in hand, on the evening this whole impossible chapter had begun. The porch post her father had shimmed 100 times still sagged faintly on the left. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the smell of cornbread drifted out to meet them on the cooling air. Because Mrs. Henderson had kept the place, tended, and the pantry stocked the whole time they'd been away, the particular quiet kindness of a good neighbor in a good, if imperfect, town. Inside, on the mantel where a shattered cherrywood box had once stood, Margaret found the pieces exactly where she'd left them, gathered carefully into a basket the night everything had first come apart. She spent an evening, not long after they returned, putting them back together. It wasn't perfect work. The seams showed, faint hairline cracks running through the reassembled wood. No amount of careful gluing could fully erase, but it held, stood upright on the mantel once more, whole enough to keep, imperfect enough to remember exactly what it had survived. Her father found her there, running her fingers slow over the mended seams, and eased himself down into the chair beside her, with the careful, deliberate movements of a man still healing, though stronger now, steadier, something slighter in his face than she had ever once seen there in 25 years of quiet Sunday afternoons. "You didn't have to fix it," he said quietly. "I wanted to." She turned the box over once in her hands before setting it gently back in its place. "Some things you keep even when they hurt to keep, Pa. Isn't that what you told me the very first time I asked what was inside it?" Something moved across his weathered face, grief and pride, and a kind of exhausted, grateful peace, all tangled together. "I spent 19 years believing I was protecting you by keeping you from the truth," he said slowly. "Never once considered I might have been robbing you of something too. The chance to know your own mother. The chance to understand why I raised you the way I did." His hand found hers, steady now, no longer trembling with fever or blood loss. Just an old man's hand resting over his daughter's. "I'm sorry it took nearly losing everything for you to finally get the whole truth, Maggie. You gave me everything I needed to survive the day it finally came," she said quietly. "Every lesson behind that barn. Every quiet afternoon I thought was just chores." She met his eyes, and something in her own gaze had settled now, finally, into a peace that had been a long, hard road arriving. "You didn't rob me of anything, Pa. You just didn't tell me, until I needed it, exactly what you'd already given me." Winter came to Larkspur Hollow that year the way it always came, sudden and certain after a long golden stall, and by the time the first real snow lay heavy on the wheat stubble, the shape of a new life had settled itself around the Colton, around the Bell family, with the particular steadiness that comes only after the worst has already happened and been survived. Ruth stayed, built a small addition onto the farmhouse with Amos Tillman's help, the two of them working through the last mild afternoons of the season, with the easy, familiar rhythm of old friends, finally given the chance to be more than distant, careful neighbors to each other's grief. Franklin healed slow but sure, strength returning to him season by season, though something in his bearing had changed permanently. A straighter spine, perhaps, or simply the visible relief of a man no longer carrying a secret heavy enough to bend him. Marshal Otis Pratt resigned his post before the first snow fell, quiet and without ceremony, and the territory sent a new marshal to Larkspur Hollow. The following spring, a younger man, sharp-eyed and unbought, who made a point, in his very first week, of calling on the Colton farm to introduce himself properly and ask, plain and direct, whether there was anything the family needed from the law that the law had failed so far to provide. There wasn't by then, but the asking mattered. And Margaret, 25 years old, dust-colored travel dress, traded now more often for the practical work clothes of a woman who no longer bothered hiding what she was capable of, found herself, that following spring, doing something she had never once imagined for her own life. On the evening the riders first came, she started teaching, not formally, not with any grand announcement, just quietly, patiently, the way her father had once taught her, a neighbor's daughter here, a young widow there, women across Larkspur Hollow, and the scattered homesteads beyond it who wanted, for reasons as varied and personal as the women themselves, to learn how to hold a rifle steady, how to read danger in the wind before it arrived, how to move through a moment of violence with a clear head instead of a frozen one. She never told them it was for wolves. She told them the truth instead, that the world sometimes came for you without warning, without mercy, without caring one bit whether you were ready. And that being ready quietly, patiently, long before you ever needed, it was the truest kind of love a person could offer someone they meant to protect. Her father watched her teach, sometimes from the porch where he still liked to sit in the evenings, mending things that mostly didn't need mending anymore, and something in his face, watching his daughter pass on the very gift he'd once given her without explanation, looked very much like peace finally, fully arrived. "You know," he told her one evening, as the sun went down orange and gentle over the same wheat field where this whole story had first begun, "I used to lie awake some nights, all those years, wondering if I was doing right by you, teaching a little girl to fight before I ever taught her." "Why and now?" Margaret asked, settling into the chair beside him, the mended keepsake box visible through the window behind them. Whole again, scarred, but standing. Her father was quiet a long moment, watching the last light fade gold across land that had asked so much of this family, and, in the end, given back a kind of peace none of them had dared hope for. Now I think, he said slowly, that some lessons only make sense once the day finally comes that proves why you learned them. He reached over, took his daughter's hand, the same steady grip that had guided her through 25 years of quiet Sunday afternoons and one terrible, unforgettable week. I'm just grateful, Maggie, that when that day came, you were ready. Whatever it cost either of us to get you there. Margaret Colton, daughter of Thaddeus Bell, granddaughter of nobody's expectations, survivor of 5 armed riders, and a night that should have broken her and instead revealed exactly what she'd been built to withstand, looked out over the darkening Wyoming plains, at the mended box glowing faint in the lamplight behind her, at the father beside her and the mother inside cooking supper, and the whole unlikely, hard-won piece of a family finally, fully whole again. And she understood, at last, the true shape of everything her father had spent a lifetime trying to give her. Not safety. Exactly. Nothing in this world was ever entirely safe, and a lifetime on the frontier had taught every soul in Larkspur Hollow that lesson plain. Something better than safety. The strength to meet whatever came, and the love, quiet and patient, and never once fully explained until the moment it was needed most, that had built that strength one careful lesson at a time. The wheat swayed pale gold in the evening wind. The mended box caught the lamplight, whole again, scarred but standing. And somewhere out past the tree line, the world went on turning, indifferent and vast, and occasionally, mercifully, kind the way it always does. For those who have finally learned, at whatever cost, exactly how to meet it.